If there's one thing I've learned living here, it's that neighbors can be a blessing, or hell on earth. And guess what? I was rewarded with the worst kind, Karen. And no, I'm not exaggerating. This woman was the exact definition of a busybody with plenty of time to make a mess. But what nobody expected was that she would go from being a simple busybody to a villain worthy of a Mexican soap opera. It all started in a rather silly way. My mother was always a little suspicious of this woman. She said that Karen looked at my father too much and smiled in a suspicious way when he passed by. We thought it was an exaggeration. I mean, who in their right mind would try to hit on their neighbor's husband like that? But, as I said, Karen was no ordinary neighbor. One day, my mother went out shopping and I was at home playing video games when I heard a high-pitched giggle coming from the living room. I was surprised, because only my father was there. I went to see what was going on, and almost threw up at the scene. Karen, sitting on the sofa, holding a glass of wine and throwing her hair back like she was in a 50s movie. "Wow, Steve, I never noticed how strong you are. You work in construction, don't you? It must be a delight to see those muscles in action." My father, poor thing, was more stuck than a computer from 1999. He held a remote control as if it were a shield against the bizarre situation unfolding in front of him. Yeah, I just came to fix the TV socket, Karen. Where did that wine come from? That's a great question. My mother didn't buy wine. Neither did my father. This woman brought her own wine to hit on my father in our house. And what's worse, she didn't even seem to care if anyone else showed up. I, of course, am not one to miss the opportunity for a row. "Karen, my mom went to the market, but if you want, I'll wait for her to come back so you can have this wine together." She gave me one of those nosy kid looks, but the smile remained. "Oh dear, I was just talking to your father. Can't I be nice anymore?" "Of course, and I'm Santa Claus." My father jumped up, mumbled something about needing to finish the job, and disappeared into the kitchen. Karen rolled her eyes and left, but not before letting go. "Your mother is very lucky. You know that?" The next day, Karen started spreading the word around the neighborhood that my mother was too controlling and that men needed freedom. And if you think that was bad enough, just wait and see what comes next. If the story had ended with Karen hitting on my father and spreading gossip around the neighborhood, that would have been enough to make me hate this woman for the rest of my life. But no, she wasn't satisfied. What Karen really wanted was much more than just to charm my father. She wanted my mother out of the way, and for that, she was willing to go far beyond the limits of embarrassment. The war began in earnest a few days after the wine episode. My mother had had enough of Karen and her giggling at my father, so she decided to nip it in the bud. One fine day, she knocked on the woman's door and got straight to the point. "I don't know what you want, but if you keep hitting on my husband, you're going to get into serious trouble." Karen, of course, did what any Karen does when confronted. She opened her mouth and pretended to be offended. "How dare you accuse me of this? I'm just nice to people. Your husband must have told you everything wrong." My mother smiled, that smile that every woman gives when she's already thinking about going on the rampage. "Yes, he told me. And guess what? My son saw it too." Karen's face wilted instantly, but this woman was worse than the plague. Instead of backing down, she doubled her bet. Over the next few days, she started telling the neighbors that my mother was jealous and paranoid. She said that my father couldn't even talk to anyone, and she'd freak out. And, to top it all off, she began to invent that my mother was violent. "People, I'm even scared of her." These days, she came to my door screaming, "I thought she was going to hit me." Of course, some of the neighbors believed her, especially those who didn't like my mother very much. Little by little, some women started avoiding my mother in the market, looking at her funny in the salon, whispering when she passed by. And Karen? Well, that bitch started making a point of being extra nice to my father. Every time he went out into the yard, there was Karen, pretending to be watering the plants, wearing short shorts and tiny sports bras, throwing her hair back and talking loudly about how she needed a strong man to help her carry heavy things. But the pinnacle was when she broke into our house again. Yes, this woman had the audacity to just walk in, without knocking, without warning, as if she owned the place. I was in the kitchen getting a soft drink when I heard her voice. "Steve, honey, can you help me? I'm trying to change a light bulb, but I'm terrible at these things." My father was sitting in the living room, reading a newspaper. He got up, confused, and I, who was ready to throw the soda in her face, jumped in first. "Karen, how did you get in here?" She smiled, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "The door was open. I thought it wouldn't be a problem." My father stood up, already impatient. "Karen, it's not because we're neighbors that you can just barge in." She made a face of false innocence. "Oh, I'm sorry. I just thought, well, I saw that your wife had gone out, and I thought you could help me quickly." That phrase, "I saw your wife leave." In other words, this woman was watching my mother. She waited for my mother to leave before hitting on my father inside our house. My father, who until then had only been trying to avoid trouble, lost his temper. "I told you, I'm not interested. Stop showing up out of the blue. Stop coming in here without permission, and stop gossiping about my wife." Karen's smile disappeared. She crossed her arms and huffed, like an upset child. "You're very ungrateful. I just wanted to be a good neighbor." And she stomped off. I thought she was finally going to give up, but people, this woman was persistent. If hitting on my father to his face didn't work, she moved on to the next plan, trying to convince my mother that my father was cheating on her. That's right, Karen tried to make my mother believe that my father was having an affair. At first, she started with subtle insinuations. Out of the blue, she started talking to my mother and saying things like, "Your husband goes out a lot, doesn't he? Do you trust him?" Or, "Oh, men are complicated. Sometimes we think we know them, but we don't know what they do when we're not looking, do we?" My mother, who had already been vaccinated against Karen's poison, just ignored it. But the damn thing wouldn't give up. Then the hard part began. Anonymous phone calls. My mother started receiving calls from an unknown number. When she answered, a female voice would say, "Open your eyes. Your husband isn't who you think he is. Or else, be careful. There's a woman trying to steal him away from you." My mother recognized the voice immediately. It was Karen. Her plan was simple, to make my mother so paranoid and insecure that she would freak out and end the marriage. That way, Karen would have a clear path to my father. But Karen hadn't counted on one thing. My mother wasn't stupid. She soon realized the foul play and, instead of falling for it, decided to turn the tables. The next time Karen called to make her insinuations, my mother replied, "You know what? You're right. I'm going to sort this out right now." And she hung up. Karen probably thought my mother was going to make a fuss and throw my father out of the house. But instead, my mother went to her house. She knocked on the door, and when Karen answered, she smiled and said, "Would you like to come in for a coffee? I'd like to talk about this story about my husband that you're making up." Karen's face went white, but before she could say anything, my mother added, "Or rather, why don't we call all the women in the neighborhood to hear this story together? Since you love to spread gossip, it would be great to clear everything up once and for all. Wouldn't it?" Karen didn't react, because the truth was, she wanted to poison my mother, but she didn't want everyone to know that she was making it up. She swallowed and tried to play dumb. "Oh, I think you misunderstood me." But my mother gave her a sharp smile. "No, dear, I understood perfectly." Karen swallowed. She knew she had lost, but even so, she still didn't give up, because after that, she tried something even lower. Something that, this time, involved calling the police on my mother. If you think Karen was going to accept defeat after being caught in the middle of her cheap seduction, think again. This woman didn't know what it was like to give up. She wasn't just nosy. She was obsessed. Only now, instead of continuing to try to seduce my father, she changed tactics. If before the plan was to steal the neighbor's husband, now she wanted to break up his marriage first. And that's when the dirtiest part of the story began. After spreading gossip around the neighborhood, Karen realized that this wasn't going to be enough to destroy my mother. Because, let's face it, my mother is a thick skin. The neighbors even whispered behind her back. But she didn't care. She knew who she was. She knew about her relationship with my father. And she wasn't going to waste time on bullshit. So Karen decided to go for something more direct. She started showing up everywhere. If my father went to the market, there Karen was, bumping into him accidentally and laughing excessively at anything he said. If my father went out to work, Karen was in her backyard, conveniently wearing minimal clothing to water the plants which, coincidentally, were right in the direction of our garage. Was my father picking up the newspaper in the driveway? Oops! Karen was, coincidentally, going to get something from her car, always throwing her hair back and trying to make conversation. The worst thing was that my father was too polite to be rude to her. He tried to keep it short, but Karen took it as encouragement. And then she did something even lower. She tried to plant evidence against him. It went like this. One afternoon, my father came home from work and went straight into the shower. My mother was just finishing dinner, and I was in the living room, fiddling with my cell phone. Out of nowhere, we heard a noise in the yard, something falling to the ground. My mother frowned and went to look out of the kitchen window. What the hell? I went after it, and when I looked, there was Karen, right in the corner of our yard, kneeling by the fence. And what was worse, on the grass next to her was a golden earring. My mother opened the door wide. "What are you doing in my yard?" Karen jumped up, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, what a fright! I lost my earring. I think it fell here by accident." My mother crossed her arms. "You lost your earring? In my yard?" "Yeah, I was standing nearby, and I think it fell off." She made that silly face, as if she hadn't just been caught red-handed. My mother looked at the earring on the ground, and then at Karen. Then she took a step forward and stepped on the earring on purpose, smashing it into the ground. "Now she's lost for good." Karen's eyes widened. "You broke my earring, and you broke into my yard. Now get out of here before I call the police." Karen turned pale, picked up the remains of her earring and stomped off, but not before casting one last venomous glance at my mother. All I could think was, did this woman really think this was going to work? She wanted my father to find the earring in the yard, and my mother to think it was hers. A plan so rotten and predictable that it sounded like something out of a cheap soap opera. But she didn't give up. She never gave up. And the next day, she was going to take this obsession to an even worse level. The next morning, my mother was at work, and I had stayed at home because my teacher had canceled my college class. My father, as usual, left for work early. I was sitting on the sofa, relaxing, when I heard a knock on the door. I looked out of the window and, guess what? Karen. What did this woman want now? I opened the door, rolling my eyes. "What is it, Karen?" She smiled, in that fake, theatrical way. "Oh dear, is your father home?" My patience was wearing thin. "He's gone out. What do you want with him?" She pouted. "Oh, that's too bad. It's just that I made some homemade cookies, and I wanted him to try them." I looked at the tray in her hand, some suspicious-looking cookies with half-melted chocolate chips. "Let me give them to him." She laughed, as if I'd told her a joke. "Oh no, I wanted to give it to him in person. You know, it's more special." "Special for who, woman?" I didn't want to prolong this, so I got straight to the point. "He's not here, Karen. Bye, Karen." And I slammed the door. I kept an eye on the window and saw that she stood there for a few seconds, biting her lip thoughtfully. Then, as if she had a brilliant idea, she picked up her cell phone and started typing something. What followed, oh my friends, it was a circus, because Karen was no longer just going to try to get close to my father. Now she was going to try to break up his marriage for good. And the way she did it, you won't believe it. If Karen had already hit rock bottom with her desperate attempts to seduce my father, now she decided to dig a little deeper. Because simply flirting wasn't enough. She wanted to break up my parents' marriage anyway. And what better way to do that? Create false evidence. The day after the earring and cookie fiasco, my mother came home from work looking a little suspicious. I was in the living room and saw her go through the door and straight into the kitchen without saying a word. My father, who had arrived just before her, also noticed and followed. "Is everything all right?" he asked. My mother turned to him, holding out her cell phone. "I got this here earlier." She put the phone on the table and pressed play on an audio. And then Karen's voice started playing. "Oh, girlfriend, I don't know what to do anymore." Her voice came out tearful, fake, as if she were acting. "Steve's been texting me all the time. He says he's tired of his marriage, that he needs someone to understand him." "Wait a minute. What?" My father froze. My mother crossed her arms, looking at him as if trying to read every micro-expression on his face. "And me?" I felt my blood boil. "That's a lie," my father exclaimed, picking up his cell phone to listen again. Karen had sent this audio to some neighbors, and also to my mother, pretending that she was venting about my father's alleged harassment. Only she made a point of accidentally leaking it, so that everyone would know. My mother, obviously, took a step back. "Are you sure about this, Steve?" My father looked indignant. "How can you believe that? I never texted that woman." I was already reaching for my cell phone to open his WhatsApp, because, facts matter. "Dad, give me your cell phone." He handed it to me on the spot, without even hesitating. I opened the messages. Nothing. No conversation, no phone call, nothing to prove that he had any contact with Karen. But I knew Karen wouldn't be stupid enough to make up a story without at least a shred of proof. So I went to his Instagram. And there, finally, I saw something suspicious. There were messages. They were only messages from her. "Mom, look at this." I showed him my cell phone. The messages all came from Karen's profile, and they were long, full of dramatic texts. "Steve, I know you feel the same way I do. There's no need to be afraid. I would never do anything to expose you. I know your wife doesn't understand you the way I do." But at no point did he respond. It was as if she was having a conversation on her own. My mother took out her cell phone, read everything, and looked at my father, who raised his hands. "You see? I never answered. I didn't even know she was sending that." Then it hit me. Karen was answering herself. She would send messages and pretend that my father was talking to her. Then she would record the audios as if she was having a secret affair. What level of insanity was that? But Karen didn't stop there. The next morning, my father went to get the car out of the garage and found something stuck to the windshield, a printed photo. The picture showed him and Karen talking in front of the house. But the caption, written in pen, read, "The truth always comes out." Now, just imagine, a married man receiving messages he never sent, listening to audios he never recorded, and, suddenly, photos coming out of nowhere. It was a trap. Karen wanted to put together a fake puzzle so that anyone, without thinking twice, would believe that my father was cheating on my mother. But she underestimated my mother's intelligence. My mother wasn't stupid. She knew there was something strange about this story, but she wasn't going to let it go either. The next day, before leaving for work, she left the house early and went to the police station. Because if Karen was creating false evidence, that was another level of problem. Meanwhile, my father and I came up with a plan. If Karen wanted to play at creating evidence, we were going to use technology against her. We did something very simple. We installed a hidden camera in the garage area, pointed at her house, and we waited. We waited for the moment when this woman would make a wrong move, and it was the next day that her trap collapsed. We woke up to a knock on the door. My mother opened it, and guess what? Karen, with the cleanest face in the world. She pretended to be surprised to see my father. "Oh, Steve, I wanted so much to talk to you without your wife around. But since she's here," my mother crossed her arms. "Just say it, Karen." Karen sighed, pretending to be emotional. "I just wanted to say that I don't blame you. I know you're confused. I know that love can come at the most unexpected moments." At that point, my father and I exchanged a look. She really believed in her own delusion. My father laughed. Karen, you're crazy. She pretended to be offended. Steve, you can't deny what you feel. And that's when I took out my cell phone, opened the hidden camera video and pressed play. On the screen, Karen appeared with a camera in her hand, trying to take pictures from a specific angle in the garage to make it look like she and my father were together. She was fabricating evidence herself. Karen looked at the screen, pale. My mother smiled. You've gone too far, Karen. The woman froze. What? That doesn't prove anything. But then my father took out his cell phone and showed me the messages. You talk to yourself, take fake photos, and spread lies around the neighborhood. That has a name, you know? My mother added. Defamation. Crime. And guess where I went yesterday morning? Karen's expression changed completely. No. Yes, my mother said. The police station. I filed a report against you. And after this video, I'm sure it's going to become a serious case. Karen looked at the three of us, at her cell phone, and then she ran. She ran back to the house like a rat running away from a trap. My mother just sighed. It was time. After that day, Karen disappeared off the map. She was never seen in the neighborhood again. And when we learned that she had put her house up for sale, we understood that, for the first time in her life, she had been forced to accept defeat. Has she learned her lesson? I doubt it. But at least she never gave our family hell again. And so ends the story of the neighbor who thought she could destroy a marriage, and only destroyed her own reputation. Tell us what you thought. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel.